I've worked the night shift at St. David's General in Texas for years, and honestly, I like it that way. The chaos of the day fades out and all that's left is quiet. Most nights it's just me, a couple of nurses, and maybe a handful of patients in the emergency wing. Nothing too crazy, but last Tuesday, I can't get that night out of my head. So, my name's Tom Hargrove. I've been a nurse here for a little over 6 years now. If you've worked the night shift in a hospital, you know it's not like the TV shows. It's pretty routine, if not a little boring. But that's what makes it comfortable. Everything's predictable. It was 11:45 p.m. when I clocked in, my usual routine. I said goodnight to the day shift nurses as they filed out, and went to the break room for a coffee. My colleague for the night was Mike Dawson, one of the most laid-back guys you'll ever meet. We'd worked together plenty of times, and we got along well. The shift ahead felt like it was going to be an easy one. That's the thing about routines. You start to expect nothing will ever change. The first few hours passed without incident. A couple of patients with minor injuries, nothing major. By 1 a.m., the hospital was almost eerily quiet. You start noticing the hum of fluorescent lights, the way the air feels a little too cold, and the sound of your own footsteps echoing in empty hallways. I was at the nurse's station reviewing charts when a soft ding broke the silence. It was the call light in room 314. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but here's the thing. Room 314 had been closed off for renovations for nearly a month. Nobody was in there. I glanced over at Mike, who had been half dozing in his chair, and pointed at the light. "Glitch?" I asked, hoping he'd confirm it was just a faulty panel. He frowned, rubbing his eyes, and leaned forward to check the log. "No one's assigned to that room. Maybe maintenance messed with something." "Yeah, probably," I agreed, but I couldn't shake this weird feeling creeping up the back of my neck. I grabbed a flashlight from the station. "I'll go take a look." Mike gave me a nod but stayed seated. The hallway leading to 314 was dark, only lit by a couple of dim emergency lights. My footsteps echoed softly as I walked, the air feeling just a little heavier with each step. I didn't want to admit it, but something felt wrong. When I reached the door, it was closed, like it had been since they shut the room down. I hesitated for a second, listening. No sounds from the other side, just silence. I knocked lightly, then opened the door. The room was empty. It looked exactly as I remembered it. No bed, just bare walls and plastic sheeting on the floor where they'd been working on the tiles. The only odd thing was that the air inside felt warmer than the rest of the hospital. Not by much, but enough to notice. I figured it could have been from the work being done, so I flipped off the call light, closed the door, and headed back. "Anything?" Mike asked when I returned to the nurse's station. "Nothing," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Just an empty room." He shrugged, and that was that. For the next hour or so, things went back to normal. I was busy with paperwork, Mike was checking on one of the patients, and for a while I almost forgot about room 314. Until the light came on again. Same room, same slow blink from the call panel. I stared at it for a second, my heart beating a little faster this time. Mike was still down the hall, so I grabbed my flashlight again and headed back, this time walking a little quicker. When I got to the door, I stood there for a moment, staring at the handle. My hand hovered over it, not sure if I really wanted to open it again. But I did. The room was still empty, just like before, but something was off. The air felt heavier, almost stifling. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight across the room. Then I noticed something strange. The plastic sheeting covering the floor had been disturbed, like someone had walked across it. Fresh footprints. But there was no one else there. I backed out of the room quickly, closed the door, and practically ran back to the nurse's station. Mike was just coming out of a patient's room when he saw me. "What's wrong?" I told him about the footprints, about how the light kept going off in a room that was supposed to be empty. Mike frowned, looking down the hallway. "Maybe it's some contractor messing around," he said, trying to sound casual. "We should check it out together." We grabbed another flashlight and walked back toward room 314. I could feel my pulse quicken with every step, and I wasn't sure why. When we got to the door, I let Mike go in first. The room was exactly how I left it, except the footprints were gone. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked, his voice low. I nodded. "I saw them, I swear." He shook his head, unconvinced. "Let's get back. Probably just a bad night." We went back to the station, and for the rest of the shift, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The call light didn't go off again, but I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting something to happen. I told myself it was nothing, just a glitch, a malfunction. But deep down, I didn't believe it. By the time 7 a.m. rolled around, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I clocked out and headed home, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night I was back on shift again, this time with Amy, another nurse. I was relieved it wasn't Mike because honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about what had happened the night before. But as soon as I sat down at the station, I saw the call light from room 314 blink on. I froze. "Amy, you see that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She looked up, saw the light, and raised an eyebrow. "Room 314's still closed, right?" "Yeah," I muttered, standing up slowly. "I'll check it." As I approached the room, my palms started sweating. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, shining my flashlight inside. But what I saw made my stomach drop. In the corner of the room, a figure stood, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of someone standing there, perfectly still. I didn't stick around to find out who or what it was. I slammed the door and ran back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding in my chest. Amy looked at me, confused. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I don't know," I stammered. "There's someone in there." Amy grabbed her phone and called security. They came up within minutes, but when they opened the door, the room was empty. No footprints, no figure, just the same empty room it had always been. After that, I couldn't stay. I called in sick for the rest of the week, trying to process what I'd seen, or maybe what I thought I'd seen. I haven't worked a night shift since. I don't know what it was about room 314, and maybe I'll never know. But every time I pass that hallway, I get this sinking feeling in my gut like something's watching. Something that doesn't belong, and I'm not going back to find out what it is. My name is Andrew Harris, and I've worked as a nurse for the last 9 years. It's not an easy job, but you learn to roll with whatever comes your way. Most nights, especially the night shifts, they're just long stretches of quiet, you know what I mean? The kind where the clock seems to slow down and the halls feel a little too empty. But a few months ago, I had one of those nights that I still can't shake off. I wish I could, but it's the kind of thing that creeps into my mind when it's late, when I'm lying in bed staring at the ceiling, asking myself if it even really happened. It was the middle of July, and I was working the night shift at St. Luke's, a small hospital out in the suburbs of Virginia. Nothing too big, but enough to keep busy. That night, the emergency department was quiet for a change, and it was just me and Tina, another nurse, manning the floor. We had a handful of patients, mostly elderly folks with long-term conditions, and a couple of people who'd been in for some minor surgeries. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was in the middle of updating charts, a bit after 1 a.m. when I heard it, a sound coming from the other side of the floor. It was faint, just a small noise at first, so I didn't pay it any mind. You get used to odd noises in a hospital. Machines beep, people move around in their beds, nothing unusual. But then it came again, this time louder, like a door slamming shut or something heavy hitting the floor. "Tina, did you hear that?" I asked, glancing over at her. She looked up from her paperwork. "Yeah, I did. You think someone fell?" "Could be." I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking toward the sound. I'm usually pretty calm during situations like this. You have to be. But as I walked down that hallway, something felt off. The air, it felt different, colder maybe, and the silence. It was heavy, like the kind that makes your skin prickle. I reached room 312 where the sound seemed to have come from. It was a private room where we had a post-op patient recovering. Mr. Garcia, a man in his 70s, had just undergone a routine gallbladder surgery the day before. There shouldn't have been any reason for that kind of noise. When I opened the door, everything seemed normal at first. The lights were dim, and Mr. Garcia was lying in bed, sleeping, or so I thought. But when I stepped closer, I noticed something weird. His eyes were open, wide open, and he was staring at the ceiling. Not blinking, not moving, just staring. "Mr. Garcia?" I whispered, leaning in to check if he was okay. Nothing, no response. I checked his vitals and everything was stable. Heart rate, blood pressure, it was all fine. But the way he was looking, like he was seeing something I couldn't, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stood there for a second, not sure what to do. Part of me thought about waking him, but something told me not to. So I backed out of the room, closing the door quietly. When I got back to the nurse's station, Tina looked at me confused. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, but Garcia's awake, just staring at the ceiling. It's weird." Tina shrugged. "Maybe he's just having trouble sleeping. It happens." I nodded, but that feeling in my gut, it didn't go away. About an hour later, I was doing my rounds again when I heard it. Another sound, this time from room 315, right across from Mr. Garcia's. Room 315 had been empty for over a week. It was supposed to be closed off for deep cleaning, so no one was supposed to be in there. I walked toward the door, the flashlight steady in my hand, my heart starting to race for reasons I couldn't explain. I pushed the door open and felt a cold draft hit me as soon as I stepped inside. The room was dark except for the light streaming in from the hallway behind me, and it was freezing cold. Too cold for the middle of summer. But the weirdest part? The bed in the center of the room had been moved, dragged a few feet from where it usually was. The chair next to it was overturned, and the bedside table was knocked over like someone had been struggling. But the room had been locked. No one had been in here since last week. I stared at the bed, trying to figure out how any of this was possible. My mind raced through all the logical explanations. Maybe someone from housekeeping had come in earlier and hadn't put things back properly. Or maybe maintenance had moved things and didn't lock up afterward. But none of it made sense. I was about to walk out when I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I shone the flashlight toward the sound and I saw it. Barely at first, but there it was. A footprint in the dust on the floor. Not a regular footprint, though. It was smudged, like someone had dragged their foot slowly across the room. I backed out of there as fast as I could, my pulse racing. By the time I got back to the nurse's station, I was shaking. I didn't want to scare Tina, but I had to tell her. "I think someone's been in 315, I said, my voice low. "The bed's moved and there's a footprint on the floor." Tina frowned. "That room's supposed to be closed. No one's been in there." "I know," I replied, "but something's not right." We both sat there staring at each other in silence. It was too late to call security for something like this. What would we even tell them? That there was a footprint in a cold room? They'd laugh us off. I decided to finish my rounds, hoping to distract myself from whatever the hell was going on. I went back to room 312 to check on Mr. Garcia, and that's when I froze. The bed was empty. I panicked for a moment, thinking he'd gotten up and wandered off. But then I noticed the blanket, neatly folded at the foot of the bed. Too neat. I ran back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding in my chest. "Tina, Garcia's gone," I said, breathless. "The bed's empty." We checked the entire floor, every room, every corner. Mr. Garcia was nowhere to be found. I tried calling his name, even checked the security cameras, but there was nothing. No one had seen him leave. By the time dawn broke, the day shift nurses arrived and I handed over my report, but I didn't mention what had really happened. They wouldn't believe me. Hell, I could hardly believe it myself. But as I left that morning walking through the quiet, empty halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us that night. I haven't worked a night shift since.